So my name is Ruth Rumack. I am the Executive Director of Education at Ruth Rumack's Learning Space. We are a center for academic support, and we provide support for all subjects and for all grades and for all particular learning needs, ranging from giftedness to anybody with any particular learning challenge or learning difference and everything in between. We'll talk more about that as we go. We have a very specific pedagogy. We really work on the direct instruction model. We use lots of hands-on activities. It's multimodal, it's multisensory. And even when we are in Zoom, which we are now, we're still virtual, but we have figured out a way to make our lessons engaging and active and keep the attention of our students and keep everybody participating and enjoying the time that we spend together, as well as promoting their success. So let me talk about our wonderful guest today, who is Jen Makwana. Jen Makwana has been with Ruth Rumack's Learning Space for over a decade and more than that.
And counting.
And counting, exactly. More than a decade for sure. Not only is she the Director of Educational Operations, but she is also the parent of children with exceptionalities. So she is the perfect person to talk to us tonight about the IEP process and the IPRC process and everything in between. So she's got lots of wonderful examples to share with us. And I'm going to get started. Let's see what we've got. We've got some people who have put some things in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing. We've got individuals. Carol, you've got a grade 1, a grade 5, and a grade 7 in French immersion. And Carol, I did get your question earlier, so we're going to be talking about some of the things you asked as well. Catherine says, public school grade 10, would like to know how to assist her in getting through the quadmester program. Yes, when she has severe ADHD and can't focus for long periods of time. All of these questions, we received so many questions in advance, which was so wonderful because it gives us a chance to really prepare our answers. And I'm going to give you a couple of administrivia pieces in terms of how the hour is going to go so that we do get a chance to answer the questions that you've sent in and save some time for some questions at particular periods during the talk as well as at the end. Some other people, Dana is saying grade 9 in public, formerly private. That is a big shift. And Estee is saying grade 7 public school in English. Patrick encouraging self-advocacy. Dana is also saying autism and ADHD entering grade 9. All, everything that we've prepared tonight is going to give you information really starting from the early years all the way through to the end of high school. And we're going to talk a little bit about the transition from high school to university as well. So let's see, let's get started. Let's jump right into it. But no, let's not. Before I do, let me remind you of some of the rules so that we can make sure that we get to everybody's questions in a timely manner. So generally, like as I said, there will be a question period built into our time together, as well as I'm going to stick around at the very end. If you have a personal or private question that you'd like to ask, or something that's very specific to your child or your child's needs that you may or may not want to share with the group, stick around because I'm going to be here afterwards. And if there is something that pertains to the particular section that we've talked about that you think would be helpful for everybody to hear and discuss, then by all means, we'll give you the signal and you can put it into the chat when we're ready. And as I said, that all of the questions that you sent in, we categorize them and we've tried to answer as many of them as we can throughout the presentation. So hopefully those questions will be answered along the way. All right, let's get started. Let's talk about, well, we're going to talk about many things today, and we want to start with the categories of exceptionalities, because when we're talking about the IEP process and the IPRC process, and we're going to get to those acronyms in a minute, the IEP, the Individual Education Plan, and the IPRC, the, oh my goodness, Individual
Identification.
Thank you. It's so many of them. Identification, process,
Placement.
and review committee.
Yeah.
Placement and review committee. Oh my goodness, got to start. Okay, take 2, start again. But first we want to talk about the categories of exceptionalities, because you cannot have an IPRC, you cannot be placed as an exceptional student without falling into one of these categories, or more than one of these categories. So you can see in our lovely rainbow, we're talking about behavioral aspects, either conduct disorders or oppositional defiant disorder. We're talking about communication disorders or disabilities, and that includes autism, as well as learning disabilities fall under the communicational disability situation. In our space, in Ruth Remack's learning space, we don't actually talk about disabilities. I want to just put that out there. It's a very hard word for me to use, although it is what the official terms are. In our space, we usually refer to LDs as learning differences or exceptionalities or learning challenges, things that get in the way of being successful. And so, you know, if I get tongue-tied a little bit on the disability side, and it's not meant as an insult to anybody, but from our perspective, we really look at the positive side of things and how we can help our students be successful, as opposed to labeling them under these particular categories, although that label is important in order to get support. All right, so under the learning disabilities category, we have all of the aspects that you would see on a formal psychoeducational evaluation, including the language processing, visual spatial processing, the visual motor processing, phonological processing, processing speed, working memory, executive functions. That's a big list of things. And of course, there are going to be different aspects of your children that have strengths in these areas, and then areas that are more challenging or weaker areas. Under these categories, we also look at intellectual exceptionalities, which also run the spectrum from giftedness, mild intellectual disability, to a developmental disability. And then we've got the neurological and physical aspects, anything that's physical and neurological that requires special assistance. I'm just going to move my chat box for a moment. And then at the end, we've got attention deficit / hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And the interesting thing that I think is important to understand about an ADHD diagnosis is that it is not considered a learning disability in Ontario. It does coexist with many other learning disabilities and many other exceptionalities, but it by itself, if you only have an ADHD diagnosis, it can be challenging to get support. And in fact, you can get an IEP and you can get some supports within the school, but it will not go through the IPRC process because it is not considered a disability on its own, although it does show up with many other exceptionalities as well. All right, now that we've got that under our belt, let us talk a little bit more about that ADHD and finding some special ed support. It is a neurobiological disorder that can impact a child's experiences of school, learning, social aspects as well. And so while having a diagnosis of ADHD can be really problematic to many students, when, especially since it affects about 1 or 2 students in every classroom, the challenge for a parent and for a student is that it is not considered a learning disability, as I was saying. However, we do know from the Learning Disabilities Association of Toronto that 30 to 50% of children who have ADHD also have a specific learning disability, in which case you would be looking at setting up support through the school for everything combined, looking at the bigger picture as opposed to just looking at the ADHD on its own. If you do have an individual, a child with just ADHD, as I said, you can get some IEP support through the school, but it's not, it won't go far enough. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later. All right, let's talk a little bit. I'm going to go back to the chat for a moment just to see what our spread is between public and private school. And I know from the chat that some of our participants are in the private school or moving from private school to public school, and most of our participants are in the public school system. I want to talk a little bit about the special education aspects of private schools because each one is different, and each private school has its own system and its own way of handling special education or student support. So it's interesting that because a private school does not operate under the same aspects of rules, really, that the other public schools do. We have to look at each individual school and decide whether it actually is a good fit for our child who has a particular learning need. And when we're looking at that, we want to look at not just, is it a good school in general, but is it a good school for my child? Will it give them the things that they need to be successful? And when I need support for that child, will I be able to get it? And, the rules of private schools for providing that extra support is that they are required to provide as much support as until it will create undue hardship, these are the words of the ministry, for the actual school. So, keeping a child in a private school because maybe you went there or another family member went there or siblings go there, but they're just not giving you the support that you need, you may want to consider that there is a limit to what a private school can provide, usually based on resources, human power, timing, etc. And so if it's not working, maybe you want to look for something else. And to know also that there are many private schools that offer special education focus. So it could be a school for students with learning disabilities, or a school that has a wide range of resources for students on the autism spectrum. So that's a little bit about the special education at a private school. Now we get to the big picture, and Jen is going to share with us a little bit about her story, as well as the pieces of the puzzle for the journey of the IEP and IPRC. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Ruth. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you tonight. As Ruth said, my role tonight is really to take you through the different stages of this process. This, on what you see on the screen right now, is an example of the process as it pertains to the TDSB. In the Catholic Board, it's really the same process, just some of the terminology is slightly different. But just to give you a little bit more on my background, as we've mentioned, I've worked for RLS for almost 14 years now. And in that time, I have had the wonderful opportunity to work with so many kids with very unique special education needs. And I've really learned a ton about how to support those students, both within the classroom and out of the classroom. Also in that time, I became a parent, and I now have 2 children that are both in the TDSB. And as we've mentioned, they both have unique learning needs. Starting with my daughter, who's in grade 5 this year. She was designated gifted in grade 3. However, we chose to stop the process after the testing. We didn't go ahead with putting her in a gifted program, and she's now in just an extended French program where she's very, very happy and things are going wonderfully for her. Then there's my son, who is in grade 2 this year, and he's really where the bulk of my special education experience comes from. So I've learned a ton about navigating the system just through the advocacy that I've had to do for him. And I will be sharing my experiences in each step of the way as we work our way through this flow chart. But first, a little history. So for my son, I was called to a meeting in the school about 3 weeks after JK started. So I didn't have a lot of time. He had a lot of trouble managing his emotions. There were a lot of outbursts. There was a lot of running out of the classroom, throwing things, hitting, kicking, you name it. We kind of knew that some of this was coming. He had been to a wonderful preschool who had some OT support for him. We knew he had some sensory challenges. And so because I knew all of that beforehand, I was very proactive before he even set foot in a school. I booked a meeting in June and told them, he's coming. This is what we've seen so far. Here's what you can expect from my son. And I honestly believe that this was one of the best things I ever did in terms of his advocacy, because they knew about him. They knew that we were trying. They knew that it was more than just behaviors that they were seeing. There was an underlying issue for him. We hadn't determined what it was yet, but it was on their radar. And I bet that many of you are probably in that same boat. You probably have a child with similar kinds of behaviors around self-regulation, impulse control, all of those kinds of things. And my advice to you is to talk about it with the school. Be as open and as honest as you can with the school about your child's needs. What that does is it helps them to see your child as a student who requires support rather than a student who needs punishment. And that was like a really important part, I think, that helped my son in that very chaotic first year of school, because everybody was on the same team and we were all trying to support him however we could. It made a huge difference. So if you've done this already, hopefully you have, if you're kind of along the way on the journey already, you've likely hit some walls. So did I. There are many walls to climb over and bang up against and all of that. But my other advice is to keep pushing, keep looking, keep asking, because you can eventually get somewhere with sort of the knowledge that hopefully we'll provide you with tonight. So back to Zach. The behaviors continued throughout JK, despite our many attempts to help him regulate within the classroom. And in January of that year, we received a diagnosis of autism for him. So that same day, I emailed the principal and I requested an IPRC meeting. Did I get one? No, not right away. Definitely not. This was in January. We did eventually get one. It was in June of that year. But along the way, there were many emails, persistent emails about escalating, concerning incidents that were happening for him in the class. There was increasing requests on my part for better support for him. He really needed one-to-one attention for many times throughout the day. At some points, they tried to tell me he could only come to school for 30 minutes a day. I told them, no, that's not going to help him. 30 minutes is not even worth it. And we just stuck with it. We tried all kinds of things and we just somehow made it through that year. I think that one of the main reasons that we ended up with the great supports that we have now, which I will talk about, is that his behaviors were very visible in a classroom. It's very hard to ignore a child who's throwing objects around the classroom. And for many of you here tonight, I would imagine that your child's behaviors may be visible, but they also might not be visible. And it's those kids that, I mean, they deserve the supports just as much as the kids who are right out there in your face, like my son was. And those are the kids that we really have to be advocating for the hardest, because they're the ones that slip through and that don't necessarily get the attention that they need and deserve in a classroom. So if you have one of those children also, stay tuned. So I think the visibility of his behaviors was one thing, but the other thing I think that really helped in my son's journey through the process was that I was very persistent. I understood the system and I was just very helpful. And by helpful, I mean like I was sending lovely, kind emails about how I could help, how everyone could help, how we could try this, how about this? And I just stuck with it until things started to really move. So we went to the IPRC in June. He was diagnosed, well, he was already diagnosed, but the way that it works is they have to accept the diagnosis and officially label him as a student with an exceptionality. And then he was offered a placement in a diagnostic kindergarten class. So this was a special kindergarten class where they focused on behavior and self-regulation. It was amazing. It was great for him. Unfortunately, the government cut it. He was the last year to get that program, so you can no longer get that program for kids with those kinds of needs in kindergarten. And then the following year, he was offered an ISP program, so an intensive support program, and it's specific to autism. So that's what he did for grade 1, and that's where he is now starting in grade 2. All right, so that's my story. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how all of this kind of works and what you might expect if you're just beginning your journey through the special education process. So firstly, I just wanted to mention that this chart that you see on the screen right now is from the TDSB Special Education Plan. And Joelle's going to pop that into the chat for you all so that you have the link to it. But it's a really great document with lots of really helpful information about how this whole process works. So we're going to discuss each of the steps along the way in more detail, but just to give you a kind of an overview, it starts over here at the beginning where somebody's noticed something, either the parent or the classroom teacher, and they've brought it to the attention of the other. They're going to try some things, and eventually it's going to end up in an in-school support team meeting, which is where the school, just the people in the school, meet to talk about what's happening for that child and think about some strategies that they can try within the classroom. From there, it goes to the SST, or school support team meeting, which is where the parent is now allowed to come and get involved in what's happening. Additionally, there'll be some outside supports that come in as well. This is where you can start the process of an IEP, and it's also what could lead to an IPRC. But we're going to get into all of those steps in more detail in the coming slides. All right, one important thing to note about this flowchart, however, it's a little misleading in that it seems as though kind of everything starts from the IPRC, and that's not necessarily true. So you can skip over the IPRC and move to the top of the flow chart where it says regular class, and you can be provided with those options for support within the regular class or a mainstream class. You don't have to go through an IPRC in order to access that support. You can also access it while you're waiting for an IPRC. However, to get to the bottom part of the flow chart, the special education class, you do need to go through an IPRC to get that placement. All right, so let's talk about stage 1 first. This is the class assessment. So this is where the teacher will begin doing screenings, assessments, all kinds of their own assessments and tools to see what might be going on for that student, whether it's a learning challenge, a behavior challenge, whatever the case may be. It's really the information gathering stage. At this point, the teacher should also be contacting you as the parent to let them know that they've noticed something's going on for your child, and finding out what information you can provide. So your role here is to share any concerns that you have. And if you have the concerns before the teacher notices the concerns, like I said, I recommend being forthright with them and going right and letting them know what you're seeing at home. Maybe it's struggles with homework. Maybe it's frustration or anxiety or something going on that they're talking about at home that they're not really showing at school. Whatever the case is, I definitely recommend being open about it and sharing your concerns. It's also a good time now to start brainstorming your child's strengths and their needs and have them written down, because as you work through the process and start going to meetings, this is going to come up a lot. It's also a great time to just start suggesting strategies. I did things because I knew my son so well. I started, making my own visuals. I had a chart with all the different things that helped him regulate. So some things that he could try, visuals that he could try when he started to feel very frustrated and dysregulated. I brought in sensory toys and helped make a calming corner in the kindergarten room. I brought in a digital clock to help with transitions because my son was really into numbers. I really recommend thinking about what are the very unique and particular things that your child is interested in or that your child gravitates to. And if you can help bring in supports that are sort of in that vein, that really goes a long way to making it a comfortable situation for your child. And if you've already sought outside help, like an OT or a tutor or something like that, get them involved too. If they have, great strategies or graphic organizers or things like that, that's something that we do a lot in our work is, we have great organizing tools that we use with our students, and we always send them to parents and recommend like laminate this, get this in the classroom as soon as possible. This is really helpful for your child. Stage 2 then is the in-school support team. And in the Catholic Board, this is called the school-based support team. So it's really just what it sounds like. It's the people within the school, the teacher, the CERT, which is the special education resource teacher, and the principal. And their job is to now come up with an action plan, because the informal strategies that you were trying in stage 1 aren't really working. And so we're going to put something a little more formal in place. This is also where they are going to create an individual learning profile for your student, and they're going to start tracking the different things that they're trying and doing to support your child. And your role really here, you're not invited to this meeting yet, but your role is really just to maintain the communication. So some of the things that they might try at this stage would be adjusting the program, for example, moving your child to the front of the class so that they have a closer proximity to the instructor. They might start chunking the work or allowing more frequent breaks. Some of those things that you'll start to see on the IEP eventually are things that they're going to start testing out in the classroom to see if that makes a difference for that student. So for some students, these interventions are successful and there's no need to go any further. However, if you don't feel like they're successful, this is your chance to speak up too, because it's not going to move past stage 2 if the school feels like these interventions are working. All right. So moving into stage 3, this is the SST or school support team. And in the Catholic board, it's known as the school-based student learning team. So this is the first official meeting that you will be invited to. And in addition to you, it also includes some outside professionals as well. So a psychologist, a social worker, a speech and language pathologist, a special needs consultant are some of the people that you might find at that meeting. So what happens there is the purpose of the meeting is to discuss the student's strengths and challenges. All of the relevant professionals will weigh in with their thoughts and opinions. And they're really working towards developing or evaluating the action plan that's currently in place, and then developing new action plans if new ones are necessary. So this could lead to the development of further supports. It could lead to an IEP if you ask for it. It generally does, but it never hurts to ask. And it may also lead to an identification, placement, and review committee, or IPRC. So you have, generally speaking, though, the IPRC tends to be seen as a last resort. Somebody had a great question about that, and I'm going to talk about that on the next page when we get to the IPRC part. So it is, and in my experience as well, it is very tricky to kind of get to that IPRC stage, even when you have a diagnosis, because it does seem to be like they will just keep being like, oh, not yet, or it's coming, and it can be kind of frustrating to actually get to one. But before that, while you're in the school support team meeting, you have a very important job. So firstly, it's to attend the meeting and to take notes, which we have more information on for you in a minute. Your role is to provide further input. So come prepared, come with your questions, come with your thoughts. And you can also request an IEP at this stage as well. From my own experience, these meetings are a lot. They're very rushed. There's a barrage of information. It's very sensitive information because they're talking about your child, and it's only 20 minutes long, and it's a strict 20 minutes. So there isn't a lot of time to really get into it all. I always felt left feeling a little shell-shocked afterwards because of just the situation. So we have some tips for you to help you kind of approach these meetings in a sort of prepared and organized way, and hopefully it'll help you kind of get through them a little easier than it was for me at the beginning. So firstly, know what to expect. There's always the same format. There's introductions around the table. You get a copy of that individual learning profile. The classroom teacher speaks first, talks about the child's strengths and challenges. Then you're given a chance to speak. This is your opportunity to ask your questions. There's time for a short discussion. They go to next steps, and that's it. You're out the door. So some things that you might want on hand for these meetings. I really recommend making a binder. I made a binder for my child when he was diagnosed. It's got tabs, it's got sections for all of his reports and his diagnoses, and everything that was ever done or tried with my child is in this binder. And I always brought it to meetings because inevitably somebody will ask for a copy of something. And if you have extra copies of everything, it makes the meeting run more smoothly if you can just pull it out and be like, here you go. It really saves some time, and it's really just nice to have all of the information about your child kind of located in one place. Another tip is to ask for what you think should happen. So you get a chance to ask questions, ask them. If you think there needs to be an IEP, ask for one. I needed a safety plan. Amazingly, even though my son was running out of the classroom, throwing things around, doing obviously very unsafe behaviors, there was no safety plan in place for my child. And so I had to insist at this point that he have one developed. And the point of a safety plan is really so that everyone in the school is then aware of the particular needs of your child and knows what the plan is. If there's some kind of meltdown or issue with your child, they know what they're supposed to do, who's supposed to be called, and all of those kinds of things. So a safety plan, if you do have a child that has high behavioral needs, I definitely recommend insisting that a safety plan is in place for your child. The other thing I think that's really important to bring to these meetings is a template to take notes on. Taking notes is great, but taking notes just on a plain loose leaf piece of paper can be very overwhelming in that very quick 20 minutes. So one thing that I made to start taking to the meetings is, and you're going to get a copy of this template in your handout package, but it's just kind of an organized way to sort of follow what happens in the meeting. So you write the date, you circle the type of meeting. If you want, you can write down who was present in the meeting. Sometimes it's helpful to remember that there was a psychologist there, or, oh, that was that SLP who was talking. Like I said, make your own list of your child's strengths and challenges. It's, I think, really nice to be able to compare your list to the list that the classroom teacher is going to give to see if you guys are kind of on the same page when it comes to your child. And then, of course, you want to list the questions that you have, and there's space to write the answers to those questions. This really helps ensure that you get your questions answered. I did leave meetings forgetting to ask questions because they got buried within my notes. So just make sure that when you get to this section, you get your questions asked and answered. Space for notes, obviously, because there is a discussion. And then I think the most important part of this template are the next steps. It's really important to write down not only what the next steps are as the meeting is coming to a close, but to get a sense of the timelines for those next steps. As I said, you leave feeling kind of overwhelmed. And if you forget to ask those things, there's all these ideas that are flowing around at the table, right? And if you leave being like, okay, great, they had all these great ideas, but then you have no sort of recourse to say, all right, well, when are those things going to start? When should we check in on them to see if they're working? Those things are really, really important. And those are one of the main things that help you move along in the process, because the school is going to try a lot of different things before they move all the way to IPRC, and you need to know how long they're going to try those things for. And sometimes things take time. So it's good to get a sense of how long they expect it to take so you know when to check in again. All right, so that brings us to stage 4, which is the IPRC, or Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. So this can happen once the necessary diagnostic assessments have been completed. So it could be a psych ed, it could be an autism diagnosis or another kind of diagnosis. And it could be requested by the principal after the SST meeting, or it's something that a parent can also request. So we're going to go through the different roles of each of the people that are involved in the IPRC. So the school's role, the principal specifically, and the teacher is to review the assessments and any kind of documentation that they have on the student. And they also need to provide the parent with a copy of the Guide to Special Education through the TDSB. They need to do that within 15 days, and they also need to give you an approximate date as to when that IPRC meeting will happen. So this is the question that we had, and I'll address that now. Is someone mentioned that, you know, they give you this approximate date, and their specific situation was that after much pushing, they've been given a date of likely in the winter. So what does that mean? What to do next? as I said, schools really want to exhaust all of the avenues before they just jump right into an IPRC meeting. I've never heard of an IPRC meeting that happens like right away in the fall. Because IPRC meetings, the placement part of the IPRC is the placement for the following year. So they're usually not in a very big rush to get to the IPRCs in the fall, because the placement that they might decide on is something that's for the student for the following year. But also because, you know, they've developed these action plans and they need to put the action plans in place and try them out and give them time to work before they rush to the end of the process. And as we all know, they're not usually in a big rush to get to that IPRC.
And can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
That 15 days within 15 days are 15 working days. So it's not necessarily 15 days in a row. You're really looking at 3 weeks because of workday weeks.
Mm-hmm. And then like this question is, you're not usually given a definitive date. You're usually given more of a time period of like, we'll be doing them in the winter or in this month or something like that.
There are so many people involved in each of these meetings that it is quite a lot to coordinate and to make sure that everybody has the right information before they enter that meeting. And also the fact that they try and group them together so that the people, the educators and the professionals who are involved have several to do at one time.
Yes, they definitely put them in clusters. So really what you should be doing while you're waiting for this IPRC is checking in on what exactly is the action plan that's happening for my child and how is it being measured. And if you can get those kinds of answers, that might help move you a little bit closer to that IPRC stage, because you're really talking about what happens next. And really that's the ultimate goal that you might be trying to get to. Also, I'm assuming that if you've asked for an IPRC and they're telling you that you'll get one in the winter, it's because you have a diagnosis and all of that documentation already in place. So the parent's job in the process is to provide any pertinent documents. If you have more information, provide it. Your job is to go to the meeting, and you're also allowed to appeal the decision if you disagree with the placement at the end of the meeting. And then during the IPRC itself, the committee is made up of a principal from another school, a board official, and a psychologist. And during the meeting, they will take all of the assessments and material that is available for review. And from that, they will decide if the student is exceptional, and as termed by the Ministry of Education, and what that specific type of exceptionality is. From there, then they decide on what the appropriate placement is for that school. So that's coming up here, whether it's in the regular class support or down at the bottom of the flow chart in the special education class support. So if you move up into the regular class support, which is generally where most students end up, there are 3 different options available to you. Regular class indirect support looks like the classroom teacher working with your child after receiving consultation from some kind of outside support. So that might be the CERT of the school, the special education teacher. It could also be outside supports. In my son's case, they brought in the autism team. There's a team of autism professionals that go to different schools and consult on changes that can be made in the classroom to better support students with autism, things like that. There's also the option for regular class support, which means that the resource teacher is coming into the classroom and working with a child either individually or more often with a small group of children. So the resource teacher might take a little group after the main instruction and kind of take them aside and work on something that's related to the curriculum, but at a more appropriate level for that particular group. And then the final option is regular class withdrawal, which looks like specialized instruction, typically from the resource teacher in the resource room, and it has to be less than 50% of the day. It's typically nowhere close to 50% of the day. Some of you have been this, probably can attest to the fact that it's generally 1 or 2 40 or 50-minute periods for the whole week. So it's generally not a lot. And generally right now, the TDSB, most schools have moved more into that model of the resource teacher goes into the classroom and supports the students within that in the classroom environment. And then at the bottom of the flow chart, and the option that's only available through the IPRC is a special education class. So this could look like two things. One is partial integration, which is known in the TDSB as the homeschool program. However, it's slowly dying. It used to start at grade 4. Now it starts only from grade 6 to 8, and it's actually apparently being phased out by next school year as well. So those supports are disappearing. But the way that it is right now, it's 50% of the day, and the focus is on language and math, and it's for students who are working at least 2 grade levels below their curriculum. The other option in special education classes is a full self-contained class, otherwise known as an intensive support program, or ISP. This is the program that my son got into in grade 1 and remains in now in grade 2. He's in an autism ISP. But they also have ISPs for other areas like LDs or MID, mild intellectual disability, developmental delay, gifted. The gifted program is technically an ISP. There's also behavior programs. There's lots of different options that cover all of the different areas of exceptionality that Ruth mentioned at the beginning of the night. These programs may also involve partial integration. So although it's called a full self-contained class, the goal of these classes is always, except if you're gifted, because that's just a special kind of unique program in and of itself, the goal of these programs is often to take some time of the day and integrate the student into a mainstream classroom, just to kind of gradually see how that goes. In grade 1 for my son, it didn't really happen at all. Last year was kind of a disjointed year, and they never really got enough in-person class time to really get that going. This year, however, in grade 2, he's already doing integration into a grade 2-3 mainstream classroom. And so far it's going really well. So that's really promising, and it's been really nice for him. All right. Ruth is now going to talk a little bit more about the special education in the secondary levels, because my experience kind of only goes to elementary so far. I'm a primary junior teacher, and my kids are grade 5 and below. So Ruth's going to talk a little bit more about what special education looks like at the secondary level. I know a lot of the people who wrote into us mentioned that they have kids in the upper years and in high school. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. But before we jump into that, I want to take a quick moment just to look at the chat, because there were a few questions I think that would be good maybe to have your input on, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is, Romina asks, is the SST, the school support team meeting, a one-time thing, or does it happen annually?
Oh, yeah, no, it definitely happens annually. Even the IPRC is an annual thing. So once you've had an IPRC, you'll have an IPRC every year. You can decline it. Actually, last year I declined it because we were very happy with the placement that my son was in the autism ISP. And I said, we don't want to move. If you don't want us to move, we don't need an IPRC. But yeah, there'll be school support team meetings all along the way. I had multiple ones, even leading up to the IPRC, because I didn't get it right away. We had a couple SST meetings before the IPRC even came. So yes.
And exactly, depending on how long it takes to get that IPRC meeting, you may want to ask for an additional one, or if something has changed drastically and if something's really not working, you may want to ask for one as well.
Yeah, think of it like a check-in, right? If you've developed an action plan and the school is implementing this action plan, there should be times where you are able to go in and check in on how that action plan is going. And if you're not getting a timely IPRC, then ask for another SST so that you can check in and see, what kind of progress is being made.
Great. And there was another question. There are a few questions about the IEP, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. So hold those. We're going to come back to those. Dave asks, are autism IST placements only available at certain schools?
Yes, so that you won't necessarily get one at your home school. There's, I can't tell you exactly how many schools that offer them, but the way that it works is you'll get offered one in a school that's as close to your home school as they can. So ours is not far. It's like a under 10-minute drive from our house, and you actually receive busing for those schools if you want it. We chose not to bus. Due to my son's needs, but you can get busing. Busing is available for those programs as well.
All right, we're going to come back to the IEP questions, and there was another question about executive functions too, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. All right, let's get to special education for secondary. Now, the secondary level, it's very different, and when you get to grade 9, it really it looks different and it operates in a different way, although there are lots of support still available to students who need them. And a lot of questions I get often center around if you have an IEP or you have a placement or an exceptionality placement in grade 6 or 7 or 8, and you're then transitioning to the high school, do all of those same things transfer with your child? So if you have been part of that school board and you're moving from the same school board from junior high to high school, they will follow your child. But again, things will change over time and your child's needs will change. And I would highly recommend, as Jen was saying earlier, which is get in front of it. And so sometime in the early to middle of grade 8, start thinking about what is my child going to need for grade 9 proactively, and start talking to the teachers in grade 8 about those things to perhaps practice those types of supports, and also have them in some form of documentation before the grade 9 year begins. And you can do that at any point, and from year to year, just looking ahead at the next year and thinking, what is my kid really going to need to be successful for next year as well? So let's take a look at the differences, what we have. The resource program, this is in the regular classroom setting, students can receive special education resource support from a special education teacher. So basically they're in their regular classroom, but they can access support from that special ed teacher when needed. It's different than in the junior school or in the primary school, because they're not being withdrawn, they're not being pulled out. It's just something that we need to create a connection with, and we need to communicate with that special education teacher, and then usually that child will see that special ed teacher at designated times, but not necessarily in the same way that they were receiving it in earlier grades. The biggest thing that I see on a regular basis is really the special course option, and then more so the GLE. So special course options, these are secondary resource programs, or RSE. These are non-credit bearing, which means that you will not get a course credit for it, but it may be an assignment that is given to your student, your child, to receive support in a particular area of need. So they may create some special assignment, the child works on it, they get feedback from the different, from the teacher of the subject matter, and it's something that is working on developing skills, but not necessarily going to apply to the credit or give them credit for their course. The other option for special courses is an optional credit course, which would be something called a locally developed course, which happens at the school, in the school, and at that school level, where they create courses for students who need support to upgrade certain skills. Again, this is something that will be very helpful if your child is, having challenges with their reading or having challenges with the math and they can't keep up with the math that's going on in the classroom. They are credit courses, but they are developed by the teachers of that particular school and often with a certain group of students in mind. So that's one option. Then we jump to the GLE, the Secondary Learning Strategies course. And this is something that most students who have a designation of, an IEP and also have a designation of a learning challenge will be taking the GLE course. And the GLE course gives you a credit. It's a credit that a child can take up to 4 of these credits. And basically it's a learning strategies course where it's a ministry set curriculum, and it varies from school to school, and teachers do have some latitude in terms of what they include in their course. But at the ground, at the foundation, it's really about teaching learning strategies, how to study, how to prepare for tests, how to keep your binders organized, how to take your assignment and break it down into smaller pieces. Each school has a different approach to it. And I've seen so many different approaches. Some courses, some GLE courses can be tremendously helpful, especially when they're really looking at teaching a student how to ask for the right supports and how to advocate for themselves, but also teaching the student to be self-reflective and figure out what is it that I need to be successful right now. Other schools don't have as deep, let's say, connection to promoting that self-advocacy. However, that credit does give them a full credit, and it allows them, at the very least, it gives them a place to do their homework and a teacher to ask questions of while they're doing their homework. So at the very least, it's almost like a study hall. And at the very best, it's a place where a student really learns more about themselves as learners, and they practice all of those metacognition and reflective skills. Okay, and Heidi says GLE is great, take advantage of these credits. I highly recommend that if your student has that available to them, that they do take the course, because at the very least, again, it gives them a place, once every day or once every 2 days, depending on the cycle, a place where they're going to see the same teacher over and over again. They're going to develop a relationship with that particular special ed teacher or GLE teacher, and it gives them an advocate within the school system. So that teacher will get to know your child quite well. Generally, they're smaller classrooms, and the teacher is privy to all of their background information. And that is the teacher that you're going to want to connect with when you realize that something is going wrong in history, or that preparing for math tests has become really difficult. At least you're going to have that one consistent person you can go back to as a parent who has a little more insider knowledge of your child, different than just a student who's sitting in a classroom of 30 and the math teacher has 3 grade 9 classrooms of 30. So it gives them. Lisa says agree. It depends on the HS, the homeschool. I think our school is using the time to teach the students how to type. Well, that's actually not a bad idea either, because when we talk about assistive technology and getting your ideas out there quickly, it can be really advantageous if it's paired with other things too. Carol asks, are there courses or programs similar to the GLE intermediate students can take before grade 9? I love that question, Carol, because we have actually developed a whole host of courses that are what I feel the GLE class should be, which include executive functioning skills, typing skills, writing skills, organizational skills, how to get your thoughts on paper, a whole host of things I'm going to talk about later. And feel free to check out ruthrumack.com. I swear, Carol, she wasn't even a plug, but you've just done it so seamlessly. So we'll talk a little bit about what we can offer as well at the end. Okay, so the last part of this for secondary level is the intensive support programs, or again, ISPs. A small number of ISPs at all grade levels support students with similar special needs. Again, you have to go through the IPRC placement in order to be eligible for any of those programs. And even the gifted program is one of those intensive support programs. Okay, let's move on. So let's talk a little bit about the IEP, because this is, as we've described already, your first step, and it is your working document. It's the thing that you're going to put all your information about your child into, and it's where you're going to request things, and it's going to be where you set your child up for the most success. So this picture is really just the first page. It's a multi-page document, and there's lots of room for you to add your pieces of information. This IEP, we need to stress that it can be developed, the individual education plan can be developed whether or not a student has been identified as exceptional by the IPRC committee, and regardless of what the exceptionality is. Even the ADHD accommodations can be accessed through the individual education plan without an IPRC meeting. So it's really important that if you feel that your child needs some extra support, your first step, as Jen was showing us in that beautiful chart, your first step is really to ask questions, to have some meetings, and to get this working document going with the input of the teacher and yourself. All right. So what is it all about? It's the goals or the outcomes set for the student for the school year. And it's not just for the school year, you're sort of written in stone in September and then left to its own devices. This is a working document, and we want to make sure that it's being reviewed both by ourselves as parents and by the teachers and the team at school. And the goals can change because a student may have a set of goals for September through to January, and then review that in January and then change those goals because maybe those goals were met and now we can move on to the next thing. It's also going to provide a list of accommodations, modifications, or alternative programming, or a combination of all three. And I'm going to tell you in a moment what the difference between an accommodation and a modification is, which is always a tricky one, but there are some very clear, there are some clear lanes in there we can access. It's also going to tell you the setting where the educational programming will be provided. So whether it's in the classroom, it's going to be partial pullout, full pullout, a different school building altogether. And what's important is that the terminology should be clear to teachers, parents, and students, so that, again, this working document is something that you can refer back to and you fully understand what it is that the teachers are talking about when they're explaining it. Okay, so let's talk about the altering your programming. And the first word is accommodations. Also, if we didn't mention it before, we will be, as part of our handout later on, sending you the Parent Power Glossary of Terms, where we've got a full page of all of the different pieces and the acronyms and a little bit more information so that, you know, I'm sure you're taking notes as well, but if you want to refer back to it, you'll have a lovely document to refer back to. So let's talk about the accommodations. That accommodations describe or we want to look at them in terms of the how, the when, and the where of program delivery. So how it's being delivered, when it's being delivered, and where that curriculum is being delivered. And it also includes teaching and assessment strategies, what kind of equipment the student may have access to, whether it's technology, assistive technology, it's an environmental adjustment. I mean, even that, an environmental adjustment such as moving to the front of the classroom can make a huge difference, or being placed next to the teacher's desk where the teacher has a chance to help refocus the student on a given time is also really important. So it's not just how they access the curriculum, but it's also how a student demonstrates their learning, which is part of why accommodations are necessary. Because it's not just the output, you know, what a teacher is sending out, but it's also what the student is absorbing and what they can share back, because that's what's going to tell us whether that student is successfully understanding the curriculum and making strides. The curriculum expectations do not change. That's the biggest thing about an accommodation, is the how, the where, and the when of the program delivery may change, but the curriculum expectations do not. So grade 9 math is still grade 9 math. And whether you're at the, you know, whichever level you're at, college, university, combination, or other, that child is still working to meet those expectations. We want to look at the 3 types of accommodations. So the instructional, so how that information is being delivered; environmental, where it's being delivered, the physical aspect; and then the assessment, how is it being tested. So some examples for instructional accommodations: we want to adjust the teaching to meet the needs of that student, and we might, for example, chunk the information. So instead of giving the student a whole page of instructions, we're only going to give them one set of instructions at a time. So you're going to do this first, and then you're going to check in with me as the teacher again. And then I'm going to give you instruction number 2, and you're going to do that. And for kids who have executive functioning challenges, yeah, I'm not done. Don't go so fast. It's really important that we break the information down so that they're not overwhelmed, because when a student gets overwhelmed, they start to shut down. And when they shut down, they're no good to anybody, and they're not really moving forward in the work. Another example of instructional change would be scribing. So let's say your kid has great ideas, and they're so creative and they're so full of ideas, but they don't have enough time to, they lose their ideas as they go along. having somebody scribe or using voice technology, voice to text technology will really help them get their ideas out in a timely way. And then they can reorganize their ideas once they've got them on the computer screen, or if somebody else is taking notes for them, handed back to them. An environmental change might look like, as I said, preferential seating, taking tests in a quiet room, using sensory tools or fidget toys, some frequent breaks, anything that's going to help them concentrate and be successful as an environmental change. And then the big one is assessment, because often kids, they can manage in the classroom, but when it comes to test taking or showing their knowledge, they have a tremendous difficulty. So things that would be an accommodation would be longer time to write the test, but it's the same test as everybody else. So the expectations don't change. Or providing somebody to read the test questions and describe the answers, or perhaps using, oral exams. There are dozens of them. And it's really looking at what would the needs for your particular child be that's going to help move them forward. Okay, now we can skip to the next one. So this is a picture of equity versus equality, or equality versus equity. And if we look at the picture, many of you have probably seen it before. I identify being 5 foot tall with the little one on the box. If you give everybody the same box, it still doesn't actually solve the problem. What we need to do is look at what the needs of each child are, give them the boxes that they need in order to reach over the fence so that we can all see the game and we can all enjoy. All right, let's move on. So now we get to the modifications, and that's the actual what of the curriculum. So changes made to the Ontario curriculum to what the student is expected to learn in a particular subject. That means that we are actually changing those expectations. And if we change the expectations, then of course the credit is not the same. It is not, grade 9 math, as I was saying before, is not the full grade 9 math credit if you've modified what that child is learning, or how or what they're expected to show in terms of their knowledge. So it could look like learning different material, being exempt from the projects, or answering a different set of test questions, doing an alternative project or assignment that doesn't meet the expectations of the rest of the standard curriculum, and also being assessed using different standards, again, that don't require the same expectations as the standard curriculum. So what's really important about a modification to understand is that modifications at the secondary grade level will impact credit attainment, which means that if you change the curriculum, your child will not get that grade 9 math credit the way that the rest of the class will. And if you do that, then that's going to impact what courses they can take later on, and of course, what happens after secondary school. So here's an example where we've got the full version Hamlet versus Hamlet for kids. They're still learning about Hamlet. They're still learning about the symbolism and the situation and all of the different parts of the story. But it's just going to be modified to a level where that particular child can grasp it, and their assessment will be based on that other level. The other thing is that when you are making a modification, or if your school has asked you for permission to modify the curriculum for your child, the clearest communication is necessary, because you really need to know how it's being modified, why it's being modified, what aspects of this curriculum are very difficult for your child to achieve. Or maybe you're coming to the school to say, I think we need a modification. The accommodations just aren't working, and we need to actually change what my child is being taught from this curriculum. Okay, what's next, Jen?
I'm going to address the IEP questions next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I love it when Jen keeps me on track. Okay, I'm going to go back and I'm looking. Okay, so some of them says, when does ending an IEP make sense? My son thrived during pandemic and remote learning, but back in school may be different. So changing or ending an IEP makes sense when they don't actually need the support anymore. If they've reached the goals that they were hoping to reach, and or the situation has changed, maybe the child has matured and is able to handle more of the curriculum on their own, So it makes sense to end it when whatever is happening is working. If it's working, but it's working because there are accommodations put in place and the machine is working to support your student in the best way possible, you don't necessarily want to end the IEP. You just maybe don't need to change it at all. Would you agree with that, Jen?
Yeah, I think so.
Because if, to end something, you can always ask for a continuation of the IEP, or you can revisit it and start a new one. But I think even if things are working, as Jen said, she declined her meeting last time, the IPRC meeting, because she felt everything was working and there was nothing more that she needed to add. But you still want to be in communication with the team, the school team, because something may come up in the future and you want to keep the lines of communication open. So unless something is completely solved, problem solved, there are no issues any longer, or you're not getting the support that you really need for that child and it's not working, there are different situations. But I think if it's working and you don't need it anymore, you can stop the communication. But I would really recommend keeping in communication anyway, because things will change as the curriculum changes too. Okay, what else? When an IEP is sent to parents every year for review, how should we be thinking about reviewing this and revising? We don't get any updates on how well things are working in the classroom. So this is where the ideal situation of having that IEP meeting and regular IEP meeting and regular IPRC meetings is ideal, because that gives you that opportunity to ask questions and to get some feedback. In the real world, it doesn't always happen that way. And that's where you as a parent need to be a little bit forceful, be a little bit forthcoming and asking for those meetings. And you should be reviewing that IEP document, I would say once a term, certainly once a year, but I like to do it on a term by term basis. So you're looking at what are the goals for this term from now till December. Have we met those goals? And as Jen was saying, what are the accountability items that will tell me that we've met those goals? And how are you assessing at school that my child has met those goals or that they haven't? So that's where the conversation comes in, I believe.
Ruth, there was a similar question that we received in advance about that, in terms of what types of things to write in the parent form prior to having that IEP set up. So as many of you know, you get a little questionnaire when an IEP is being developed for your student. It's actually the time of year, probably some of you are sitting with them in your hands right now. Mine's right now. Mine's here. That's a great question in terms of what kinds of things should you be writing on that parent consult form. And another person asked, like, how do I move my child along in their learning? What are some reasonable supports to ask for?
So the supports, one of the things, and I'm going to go to I got to find that note, because we talk a lot about the supports are there, the accommodations are there to remove a barrier. And if we, instead of thinking about it as something that is going to, either label the child or give the child a crutch, or, if my child gets this accommodation now, are they going to need it forever? I like to look at it as the removal of a barrier. So if my child, for example, has trouble focusing, that there's too much activity going on, has trouble focusing, and a perfect accommodation for that might be using noise canceling headphones in the classroom. The barrier to success is they can't focus because there's too much activity. But if we can find a solution to that barrier to success, then we can be successful. At least we can try it and see what works and what doesn't. What else? Some general ones. So do we have a list of them, or are we?
Yeah, I have some stuff here. So basically, I recommend when you're filling out that form, just to give as much information as possible, especially if things have changed. And that's why you get the form again every year, because things could have changed for your student. Right now, things have changed a lot, right? So if you've noticed some things, having seen your child work online over the past year that you think might be helpful, put that in. This is where you have a chance to ask for things that that work for your child. You can ask for technology. You can ask for strategies that work well. There's a lot of talk about, supporting the child with transitions. You can ask for visual schedules or sensory breaks, first then strategies, all kinds of things that can help support your child's behavior and emotional needs can go into those documents as well. And then another really important thing to ask for is to ask for things that help with the child's executive functioning, because this is a real struggle for students from all grades. So ask for, note-taking strategies. If your child needs help with getting those notes, getting copies of the notes, ask for having their assignments chunked for them, if that's an overwhelming thing for them to tackle on their own. Any kinds of things that work for your child. Try to think about the things that you do at home as a parent to get your child out the door. If there's something that you do that works, if it can be adapted in some way in the school environment, think creatively about that and see if there's something that you can ask for that can help your child.
I would say also that when we look at the high school years or the older years, we want to look at assessment and accommodations for assessments, because the test taking situation can be really stressful for a lot of students, especially kids with any type of memory issue or executive functioning issue where it takes them a long time to get their thoughts on paper. So some of the accommodations I would ask for right off the bat would be, time and a half or double time if that's necessary. Usually schools will give time and a half, and you want to be very specific about what does that look like for that particular child. So are they going to be required to take their test in the GLE room or with the special ed teacher, and they have to do it over their lunch period? Are they going to have to split it up? So come and do half an hour early in the morning and then do the rest of it with their classroom. There are many different ways that a school will work. So just asking for time and a half is helpful, but it's even more helpful if you can relay to your child what that's actually going to look like and what should be happening. Often somebody made a comment, Heidi made a wonderful comment. She said that don't assume that your child's teacher actually knows that they have an IEP or that they have to follow it. That's part of that communication, which is, making some phone calls or some emails early in the year just to say, hey, I just wanted to let you know my child so-and-so is in your class and I'd love to tell you a little bit more about them. And these are the things that we know, that we have listed as accommodations. And I'd like to talk to you about how that's going to work within your classroom so that the teacher is aware of it, you're aware of it. And again, the student themselves knows what can they ask for. It's tricky with students, especially as they get older. They don't want to be singled out. But, it's something that's part of the communication with your child. We're going to talk about in a moment, this slide, sharing the diagnosis. So time and a half, asking even, something as simple as taking a test, especially let's say a math test for somebody who has visual spatial challenges and blowing it up. So if it was a 3-page test, get them to photocopy it bigger, especially if you're working with a grid, anybody who has graphomotor issues or has trouble lining things up, to make sure that they have a bigger space to work on. I can't tell you the number of tests I've seen, math tests particularly, or any test where you have to write an answer in a box where there just wasn't enough room. And so the student got all overwhelmed and couldn't concentrate any longer and really did poorly, not because they didn't know the material, but because there wasn't enough space for them to write or because they couldn't see things clearly enough to organize their thoughts or their work. So those types of accommodations, and really talking about assistive technology. And we have many programs for assistive technology, and we'll be having a webinar later in the school year also about assistive technology, where we can give you very specific strategies for different needs as well. Okay, so
Ruth, that actually also kind of relates very nicely into a couple other questions that we got in advance.
I love that.
Which was, people know that public schools particularly have limited resources. Teachers are overwhelmed right now. So what is the best way for my child to receive the accommodations she needs given these conditions? And related to that, someone asked, why are schools so resistant to create IEPs if there isn't enough support at a school to go around because there are too many kids in need, possibly with greater needs than your child? Is it still worth fighting for an IEP? So I think all of those things that you mentioned, and I think Patrick had a really good suggestion in the chat as well about asking for reference sheets if your child has memory issues. And these are things that will be on the psych ed report if you have a psych ed for your child. Those things like slow processing speed, for asking for extra time, memory issues will usually get open doors to reference sheets and things like that. But I think it's really important to note that accommodations aren't just time with the resource teacher. There's so many other things that don't require an actual human body to be there to provide those accommodations. So those are really in these times and in any times really, those are really the things to look at. I love the idea about blowing up a test and things like that. It's small, simple things like that that can really help a student succeed when in a regular situation, they may not have succeeded.
Another thing that I found really helpful for our high school students is the ability to take an oral test after they've done the classroom test. And remember that, you know, for most of our high school kids, they don't want to be, as I said, singled out. They don't want to seem different. They don't want to take their test in a different place than everybody else because of the stigma that they may carry for themselves. I think so many kids these days have different needs that are accommodated in different ways that it's becoming less and less of a stigma. I want to say, I hope that's the case. And the fact that the more honest we are and open about it with our kids, and it's not a label, it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just the way that your brain works. It works differently than the person who's sitting next to you, and their brain works differently than the person sitting next to them. But the fact that schools still, you know, I like to say that we're in the 21st century, but our school is still working on a 19th century model. And so we've made huge strides in all kinds of areas of neuroscience and education and all kinds of philosophy and all sorts of things. But we generally still teach, especially at high school, teacher at the front, student at the seat, and we're just expecting that student to absorb all the information, but it doesn't work for everybody. And in fact, it probably works for a minority of kids in that classroom. So we've got to empower our students to feel good about themselves and to know what to ask for that's going to give them success. So to that end, somebody just asked, can you explain what a reference sheet is? Yes, so a reference sheet would be, and this is something that you would need to have, your child needs to have approved by their teacher, usually 24 to 48 hours before the test. Basically, I can kind of call it a cheat sheet, but it's not cheating because it would be, you know, key information or key formulas, something that would trigger your child's memory in terms of an item or a piece of information. It could be a series of steps, you know, in terms of how to approach an essay question. First, I'm going to make my notes. Second, I'm going to, you know, whatever little prompts they need. I like to think of a reference sheet as your little angel sitting on your shoulder, whispering things in your ear that are going to help you remember what you need to remember. It's not telling you the answer, and it's not telling you how to do a particular question, but it may, here's an example. Let's say they're doing algebra or they're doing order of operations in math. All my references are math today. I don't know why, but let's say they're doing math. They need to remember that it's, you know, brackets, exponents, adding and or multiplying and dividing, and then adding and subtracting. There may be a visual that they can put on that reference sheet that just reminds them what to do in sequence, especially if they have executive functioning order, disorder, or memory issues or visual spatial issues. Those are helpful. So I hope that helps, Angela, to help explain what that is. Who normally creates a reference sheet? Dana wants to know. Usually, well, at RRLS, it's part of what we do with our students in preparing them for a test. It's not necessarily something that they will be, each student may not be allowed to use that reference sheet, but it's part of our process for test studying. So it's a great way to study, even if you're not allowed to take the sheet in with you. If you've prepared it ahead of time, the student can prepare it ahead of time, the student can prepare it with their teacher ahead of time, or the teacher may offer a reference sheet that they've already approved, that those are the things, and the student may be able to add some extra notes on there. So it could be a combination, whatever that teacher agrees to. And again, that's something you want to put in your IEP, that the student is allowed to have a reference sheet. Okay, what else? Shall we move on?
Yeah, I think that covers most of our IEP questions, unless anybody has any more. I think we've
If you got any more, you can stick them
here.
in now. And I want to keep an eye on the time. It's 8:20 now. And I know we're already out of time, but I told you there's just so much information. There's no way that we can get through it all in an hour. I think next time we should make this like a weekend parent extravaganza. Okay, so are there any other questions? Not yet. Okay, let's move on, and we're going to wrap up the rest. So when we talk about sharing a diagnosis, and Jenna's going to jump ahead, and supporting your child, we touched a little bit when we talk about, helping your child empower themselves, feeling comfortable with what their needs are, feeling comfortable with what their strengths are. This is the thing that we really focus on at Ruth Rumack's Learning Space, which is looking at, what am I really awesome at? What are my strengths? What are the things that I know I can do well and I can do independently? And then we look at, what are my areas of challenge? What are the things that are more difficult for me personally, things that I takes me longer to do, or I need more exposures to. And having an understanding of what your learning style is and what your learning preferences are, as well as your learning needs, because they're different things, helps a child understand what questions to ask or what things to ask for. And one of the things, a lot of parents say to me, I don't know that I want my child to know that they have ADHD or that they have a learning disability, because I don't want their self-esteem to be hurt, or I don't want them to feel labeled and feel that this is the pigeonhole that they're going to be in for the rest of their lives. And I really think that we owe it to our kids to help share information about themselves with others, but also to understand it for themselves. And a quick anecdote, we had a student who was very frustrated and had a lot of, really negative self-talk, and really felt down on themselves about their ability to be successful in the academic world. And bright, so smart, so charming, lovely student, but really didn't understand why she had so much trouble focusing, why she had so much trouble completing an assignment, why did she have so much trouble studying for a test and being on time for class. And when she finally went through the psychoed process, and it was discovered that she had a learning disability and she had ADHD, the first thing she said, with tears in her eyes, to her parents was, "I'm not dumb. I'm not lazy. I'm not stupid." And those are never words that I would use to describe any of our students, but that is how she felt, because of the fact that she couldn't keep it together for the things that she needed to do, either in school or in life. But once she understood what her learning disability or challenge was, what the ADHD meant and how it manifests itself for her, she was able to now talk about it and say, oh, okay, well, I know that I need more time to study for this test. I can't leave it to the night before. I'm going to have to start a week in advance. And we worked with her also with lots of different strategies and tools to give her the confidence that she needed to be able to ask the questions or ask for things that would be of benefit to her. Okay, so I highly recommend having a conversation that's at an appropriate level with your children. Share something, because they've gone through all of this testing. They're being put under a microscope. They deserve to know why, and they deserve to know the outcome of those tests. Okay, let's move on. What else have we got? Now there's the parent support. How do we support? How do we advocate? Well, Jen has very nicely shared her template to keep her notes organized. Keeping organized notes is a huge piece of the puzzle here. Building the relationship, making sure that you are pleasant. My grandmother always said, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So you want to be persistent, but you want to be pleasantly persistent about it. definitely you want to follow the chain of command. And what that means is you want to follow the structure that the school has set out. You don't want to jump from having a conversation with the teacher all the way to the superintendent because you didn't get what you asked for the first time. In the chain of command, I've got to jump to my notes. Let's see where my chain of command is. We usually starts with the teacher, then maybe a special support teacher, then the principal. Then if you have to escalate, it goes to the board office, maybe the superintendent, and then the trustee if it's really getting out of hand, and then the ombudsman. So there are a lot of people to touch base with before we get sort of to the furthest extreme. Another really big tip that's really helpful is to document all your chats and your phone calls. So if you've caught a teacher at the end of the day and you had a quick conversation with them about something that's coming up, send an email that night just to say, hey, I just wanted to recap. This is what we talked about. And thank you so much for your support in moving this forward. Any phone call that you have, again, follow up with an email at the end of the day or directly after, and list the bullet points, and then ask for that teacher or that person to acknowledge receipt. And if you've made any mistakes or you misinterpreted anything, allow them to put their 2 cents in as well. My brother-in-law, who's a lawyer, taught me that many years ago. He said every conversation he has with his clients or with the opposite side, he sends the email, he puts his bullet points out, and then he says, if anything is different than you remember, please let me know. And then it allows for that conversation to continue. And then, of course, be aware of your child's strengths and challenges and be realistic, because there are some things that may not be possible at this time. We're very big believers in a growth mindset. So it may not be possible right now, but we want to ask for things that can be put in place quickly and easily so that we can get the supports going in the best way possible. And then I would really say, find your own support network, because it's tough. It's really tough. Having a child with particular needs, having any child is difficult. Having a child with particular needs or more than one is really hard. So whether it's in your partner, in another family member, make sure that it's hard sometimes, as if you've got two parents in a situation that may or may not be aligned, but have those open conversations and share what your challenges are, and be open to the feedback from your other half. I would also say looking, and again, let me go back to that, because often we have situations where parents or guardians are not either on the same page, or they're working from 2 different households. So you want to make sure that there is, as best you can, some communication between all the parties involved so that it's smooth for the child as well. There are lots of Facebook groups and meetup groups and lots of Ontario-based organizations that you can access. We have lots of resources on our website. So if you go to ruthrumack.com, under parent resources, we have lots of lists of different things that you can join and places for information and other resources. There are educational consultants who will also be helpful with advocating. And we do some of this work in our academic support as well, where we will give parents lots of suggestions and strategies and tips to share with classroom teachers, or things that they can be doing at home as well. All right, Lisa says, is the chain of command in high school the same? Yes, it is. All right, what else? This is us. So I would love it if you would take a moment and just put the 1 or 2 big takeaways that made sense to you, or something that you can go home and implement right now. I guess you are home, but you can implement right away. I would love to get your feedback. We do this parent seminar a few times a year, and we change it here and there depending on what information we get. And so your feedback is greatly appreciated. And also, if you would like more information about what we do provide one-on-one support. It's all virtual right now, so you don't even have to be in our neighborhood. And we do a lot of work with technology training, executive functioning skills. There was a question earlier about ADHD. I'm going to circle back to that when we've wrapped up if you want to stick around. We do a lot of test preparation if you're going into private schools, as well as going into college for the SAT and ACT. And what else? And we do lots of group classes. So we have a whole host of group classes that you can check out on our website. Everything from math, written expression, keyboarding. And these are classes that we have designed personally ourselves based on the needs of students and their feedback, as well as this idea of a direct instruction model where you're giving all of the pieces of information. They're chunked, it's very systematic and structured. And when you finish the course, you will leave with a whole set of strategies to apply to whatever subject we're looking at. All right.
Ruth, Patrick is now keeping you on track, reminding you that you were going to talk about the post-secondary considerations as well.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. So we like to look at that transition period. And the most interesting thing that I have found in my research is that the universities and colleges actually have way more accommodations than the junior schools or high schools have at all. And you can get things at the university or college level that you would like just roll over for if we were in the high school situation. So when you're considering what high school or where you're going after high school, post-secondary, there are a few things you want to consider. A university will need a 2-year new psychoed, which means that you want your child to have had a psychoed, probably a new one in end of grade 11 or the beginning of grade 12. Best time to do it is probably end of grade 11, summer of grade 11, so that it's ready and it's all written. It usually takes, anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 months for a psychoed to be completed. And you need that current document so that the university can make appropriate accommodations or whatever you're requiring. But the other interesting thing about that is that when your child is 17, they are now taking the adult psychoed as opposed to the younger version psychoed, and that's the psychoed that the universities need. So if your child is 16 and you're thinking of having them redo their psychoed, you may want to talk to the psychologist about waiting until they turn 17 so that psychoed will still be fresh for the universities. Also, what else can I tell you about the considerations? You want to really, if your child has particular needs, you want to visit those universities. You want to see what they're doing. You want to talk to their learning centers. You want to really even talk to some students who have used the accommodations so that you know what your child is getting into. But again, you want to look at, is it a big university where my child's going to be one person in a lecture of 1,000, or are they going to be one person in a lecture of 40? And this, there are different programs for different things as well. On that note, next week, and I'm going to get my dates out, we are actually doing another parent seminar called University Transition. And get my sheets to the right place. So University Readiness is going to be next Thursday, September 30th from 7 to 8, probably 7 to 8:30, just to let you know. And we're going to go over all sorts of things about making that transition, both the academic portion. It's not just for students with exceptionalities or special needs, but it does just talk about the general transition, how to support your child through that transition, as well as mental health aspects and how to access support within the university system. So stay tuned for that. I would love it if you could join us for that. That, as I said, is next Thursday, September 30th from 7 to 8. And then coming up in November, Thursday, November 4th, is our Assistive Technologies workshop, where we're going to go through all sorts of different learning needs and the technologies that will benefit them. And then Thursday, November 18th will be executive functioning, which will be very helpful for anybody who has a child with focus issues or has been diagnosed with ADHD. And it talks about not just the physical aspects of, executive functioning, keeping your stuff together, staying on time tracking, but also the cognitive aspect of sequencing, getting your thoughts out, and being able to look at the bigger pictures and break things down into smaller pieces.